The coral dust kicked up by the Japanese mortar round stung my eyes like broken glass, and through the vision blocks of our Sherman tank, I could see the orange muzzle flashes winking from the ridgeline like deadly fireflies. My hands were slick with sweat on the control sticks as another 47mm anti-tank shell screamed past our turret, close enough that I felt the heat through the steel. "Mac," shouted our gunner, Corporal Jimmy Torres, his voice cracking over the intercom. "They got us bracketed." But I knew we couldn't turn back now, not when Bravo Company was trapped in that coral hell, surrounded by Japanese bunkers and running out of time. It was September 18, 1944, 3 days into what Brass had promised would be a quick 4-day operation to secure the tiny coral island of Peleliu. They were wrong, dead wrong. What we found instead was 15,000 Japanese soldiers dug into the most hellish fortress I'd ever seen, coral caves and reinforced bunkers that our naval bombardment had barely scratched. Now, as the driver of Sherman tank number 324, call sign Ironhorse, I was part of the 1st Tank Battalion supporting the 1st Marine Division in what had become a meat grinder that would make Tarawa look like a Sunday picnic. My name is Staff Sergeant Michael Patrick O'Sullivan, 23 years old, from South Boston, and he'd been driving tanks since Guadalcanal. But nothing had prepared me for Peleliu. The island was only 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, but every square foot of it was a death trap carved from razor-sharp coral and reinforced with Japanese concrete and steel. "Driver, move out," came the voice of our tank commander, Lieutenant David Kowalski, through my headset. "We got Marines dying up there." I slammed Ironhorse into gear, and our 33-ton Sherman lurched forward through the shattered palm trees and coral debris. Behind us, the rest of our tank platoon, 4 more Shermans, followed in a loose wedge formation. Our mission was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Punch through the Japanese defensive line along the central ridge and extract the survivors of Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, who had been cut off for 6 hours in a coral pocket nicknamed Death Valley. The landscape of Peleliu looked like something from another planet. The naval bombardment had stripped away most of the vegetation, leaving twisted metal, shattered coral, and the charred stumps of what had once been a tropical paradise. The coral itself was the worst part, sharp as razors and white-hot under the Pacific sun. It cold shred a man's uniform and skin in minutes. But the Japanese had turned this natural hellscape into something far worse. "Contact front," Torres called out, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Bunker complex, 200 yards, 11 o'clock. Through my periscope, I could see the concrete and coral fortification built into the ridgeline. It looked like a natural rock formation, but the steady wink of machine gun fire gave it away. These weren't the simple log bunkers we'd faced on other islands. The Japanese had spent months building these positions, using reinforced concrete, interlocking field soft fire, and camouflage that made them nearly invisible until you were close enough to die. "Gunner, bunker," Lieutenant Kowalski commanded. "Identified," Torres responded, traversing our 75mm gun toward the target. "Fire." The Sherman bucked as our main gun roared, and I felt the familiar pressure wave through the driver's compartment. The high-explosive shell struck the bunker dead center, sending up a shower of coral and smoke. But when the dust cleared, the machine gun was still firing. "Negative effect," Torres called out, frustration clear in his voice. "That thing's built like a fortress." And it was. What we didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that the Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had spent 8 months turning Peleliu into the most sophisticated defensive system in the Pacific. These weren't beach defenses designed to stop a landing. These were positions built to bleed us white in a battle of attrition. Every bunker connected by tunnels, every position supporting the others in a web of interlocking fire that could cut down a Marine company in minutes. "Keep moving, Mac," Kowalski ordered. "We can't get bogged down here." I pushed the throttle forward, and Ironhorse growled ahead through the coral dust and smoke. To our left, I could see Sherman devil dog taking fire from what looked like empty ground, until you realized the Japanese had positions carved right into the coral face, invisible until the muzzle flashes gave them away. The radio crackled with desperate voices. Tank support to grid 247-189, immediate. We got wounded Marines, need extraction now. Counterattack forming on the reverse slope. But our orders were clear. Get to Bravo Company. They'd been cut off since dawn when a carefully planned Japanese ambush had caught them in a coral bowl surrounded on 3 sides by enemy positions. The survivors, maybe 40 Marines out of the original 120, were fighting for their lives in whatever cover they could find, running low on ammunition and taking casualties every minute. Movement front, called out Corporal Billy Henderson, our assistant driver and machine gunner. Japs with satchel charges. Through the dust and smoke, I could see them, 3 Japanese soldiers sprinting toward us with explosive packs, willing to die if they could take our tank with them. This was another nasty surprise the Japanese had prepared for us. Instead of trying to stop our tanks with anti-tank guns they didn't have many of, they used human bombs, soldiers carrying 20-pound satchel charges who would throw themselves under our tracks or against our hull. Henderson's .30 caliber machine gun shattered to life, sending a stream of tracers toward the Japanese soldiers. One went down immediately, but the other 2 kept coming, zigzagging through the coral outcroppings with the desperate speed of men who knew they were already dead. Can't get 'em both, Henderson shouted. Hard right. Hard right, Kowalski ordered. I yanked the right control stick back and pushed the left one forward, spinning Ironhorse in a sharp pivot turn. The surviving Japanese soldier dove toward where we'd been a second before, his satchel charge exploding harmlessly against a coral boulder. The concussion rattled our teeth, but we were still moving. Good driving, Mac, Torres called out. But there wasn't time to celebrate. More muzzle flashes were winking from the ridgeline ahead, and I could see the smoke trails of mortar rounds arcing toward us. Incoming, someone screamed over the radio. I couldn't tell who. The first mortar round hit 20 yards to our left, showering us with coral fragments that rang against our armor like deadly hail. The second one was closer, close enough that the concussion made my ears ring even through my tanker helmet. But the third one, the world exploded in orange flame and flying metal. The mortar round hit directly behind us, close enough that it lifted our rear end off the ground for a terrifying second. Alarms started screaming in the engine compartment, and I could smell smoke. Engine temps climbing, I reported. We're losing coolant. How bad? Kowalski asked, but his voice was tight with the knowledge that a disabled tank in this killing ground was a death sentence. I checked the gauges, my heart sinking. Temperature's in the red, but she's still running. Maybe 20 minutes before she overheats completely. 20 minutes. That had to be enough time to reach Bravo Company and get them out. It had to be. All tanks, this is Steel Leader, came the voice of Major Robert Blake, our battalion commander, over the radio. Enemy resistance is heavier than expected. We're taking serious casualties. But those Marines are counting on us. Press the attack. Press the attack. Easy for him to say from his command post. But we pressed it anyway, because that's what Marines do. That's what we'd always done, from Belowood to Guadalcanal to Tarawa. When Marines are in trouble, you go get them, no matter what's in the way. The ridgeline ahead was alive with Japanese fire. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, and the occasional anti-tank gun all focused on our small column of Shermans. But we could see our objective now, a coral depression about 300 yards ahead where the smoke from American hand grenades told us Bravo Company was still fighting. There they are, Henderson called out. Through the swirling dust and smoke, I could make out the olive-drab figures of Marines huddled behind coral boulders and in shell craters, their rifles and bars sending streams of fire back at the Japanese positions surrounding them. But getting to them meant crossing 300 yards of open ground, swept by at least 6 machine gun positions. It was a gauntlet that would test every bit of armor and luck we had. All Ironhorse tanks, this is Ironhorse leader, Kowalski transmitted to our platoon. Line abreast formation. We go in fast and hard. Gunners, suppress those bunkers. Drivers, don't stop for anything. Let's go get our Marines. I could see the other 4 Shermans spread out in a line beside us, their guns traversing toward the enemy positions. These were good men, tankers who'd fought from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, who'd seen more combat than most infantry. They knew the odds as well as I did, but they were here anyway. Move out, Kowalski ordered. I floored the throttle, and Ironhorse shot forward like a 33-ton bullet. The ground was rough coral and shell holes, making the tank buck and pitch like a small boat in heavy seas. Through my periscope, I could see the Japanese positions growing larger, concrete bunkers and coral caves that looked like the mouths of hell. The machine gun fire started immediately. Tracers streaked past us like deadly fireflies, and I could hear the metallic ping of small arms fire bouncing off our armor. But it was the heavier stuff that worried me, the anti-tank guns and the big mortars that could punch through our steel skin like it was paper. Bunker left, Torres called out. Firing! Our 75mm gun roared, and I saw the high explosive shell slam into a Japanese position, sending up a geyser of coral and smoke. But there were so many of them. Everywhere I looked, there were more muzzle flashes, more positions we hadn't seen before. To our right, Sherman Hellcat took a direct hit from what looked like a 47mm anti-tank gun. The armor-piercing shell punched through the turret side, and I saw flames start to lick around the commander's hatch. The tank slewed to a stop, smoke pouring from every opening. Hellcats hit. Someone screamed over the radio. Crew bailing out. I wanted to stop, wanted to help, but Kowalski's voice cut through my thoughts. Keep moving. We can't help them if we don't reach those Marines. He was right. In tank warfare, sometimes you had to leave the dead and wounded behind, had to keep moving toward the objective no matter what. It was the hardest part of the job, not the fear or the discomfort or even the enemy fire, but the knowledge that good men were dying while you drove past. 200 yards to go. The Japanese fire was getting heavier, more concentrated. They could see what we were trying to do, and every gun on the ridge was focusing on our little column of tanks. Anti-tank rounds screamed past us, close enough that I could feel the heat through the steel. They got us dead to rights. Henderson called out, his machine gun chattering as he tried to suppress the infantry positions we were overrunning. And they did. This was what the Japanese had been waiting for, American armor trying to cross open ground where they could bring every weapon to bear. It was a textbook killing field, and we were driving right into it. But we were also bringing something the Japanese hadn't counted on. 5 Sherman tanks with veteran crews who'd been fighting in the Pacific for 2 years. Our guns were working overtime, pumping high explosive shells into every bunker and cave we could see. The concentrated firepower of 25 tons of American steel was something even the Japanese fortifications couldn't ignore. Target front, Torres shouted. Big bunker, 12 o'clock. Looks like a command post. Through the dust and smoke, I could see it, a large concrete structure built into the base of the ridge, with what looked like communication antennas sticking out of the top. Japanese soldiers were running in and out of it. Andy could see the muzzle flashes of at least 3 machine guns. That's gotta be their CP, Kowalski said. Take it out. Torres traversed the gun and fired. The 75mm shell hit the bunker dead center, and the entire structure seemed to collapse in on itself. Secondary explosions told us we'd hit something important, ammunition or fuel stored inside. Beautiful shot, Henderson called out. And it was. For a moment, the Japanese fire slackened as their local command structure was disrupted. 100 yards to go. I could see individual Marines now, their faces blackened with coral dust and powder burns, their utilities torn and bloody. They were tough men, Marines from the old breed who'd fought at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, but they'd been under fire for 6 hours, and it showed. Ironhorse leader, this is Bravo 6, came a new voice over the radio, the company commander calling from the pocket. Thank God you're here. We got about 40 effectives left, plus 15 wounded who can't walk. We need immediate extraction. 40 men left out of 120. The arithmetic of war was always brutal, but it never got easier to hear. Roger, Bravo 6, Kowalski responded. We're coming in hot. Get your people ready to move on my command. 50 yards. The Japanese fire was reaching a crescendo now. Everything they had focused on stopping us in these last few seconds. An anti-tank round punched through our front slope armor, missing me by inches and slamming into the transmission housing. Sparks flew, and I could smell burning oil. We're hit, I called out. Transmission's damaged, but we're still mobile. Keep her running, Mac, Kowalski ordered. Just a little further. 25 yards. I could see the Marine positions clearly now, shell holes and coral outcroppings where desperate men had fought off attacks all morning. Some were firing back at the Japanese positions, but others were just lying there, too wounded or exhausted to move. 10 yards. The Japanese realized what we were doing and intensified their fire. Machine gun bullets rang against our armor like deadly rain, and I could see muzzle flashes from positions we'd driven right past. Japanese soldiers in spider holes and caves who'd let us go by so they could fire into our backs. 5 yards. Break! Break! Kowalski shouted. I hauled back on both control sticks, and Ironhorse skidded to a stop in a shower of coral dust right in the middle of the Marine perimeter. Immediately, Henderson was out of his hatch with his Thompson submachine gun, providing close and security while the Marines prepared to mount up. Load 'em up, Kowalski called out, climbing out of the turret. Wounded first. What followed was organized chaos. Marines dragged their wounded buddies toward our tanks while we provided covering fire with every weapon we had. The Japanese, realizing they were about to lose their prey, threw everything at us: mortars, machine guns, rifle fire, even a few more satchel charge attacks. I kept the engine running, watching the temperature gauge climb steadily into the red zone. We were running on borrowed time, and everyone knew it. If the engine seized up now, we'd never get out. Come on, come on. Someone was shouting. I couldn't tell who over the noise of gunfire and engines. Marines were climbing onto our tank, wounded men being passed up to the able-bodied who would hold them during the ride out. Through my periscope, I could see the other Shermans taking on their loads of Marines. Devil Dog had about 12 men clinging to her hull, while Boston Brawler was carrying what looked like an entire squad plus wounded. But I could also see that we were running out of time. The Japanese were massing for a counterattack, and our ammunition was running low. We'd been firing continuously for the past 10 minutes, and even Sherman tanks couldn't carry unlimited supplies. That's everybody, called out Captain Robert Morrison, the Bravo Company commander, as he climbed-onto our engine deck. Let's get the hell out of here. All tanks, this is Ironhorse leader, Kowalski transmitted. We're loaded and moving out. Stay close and keep firing. I slammed Ironhorse into reverse and began backing out of the pocket. Behind us, the Japanese fire was intensifying as they realized their quarry was escaping. Mortars started falling among our tanks, and I could see fresh muzzle flashes from positions that had been quiet before. The Japanese were committing their reserves to stop us. Contact right, Taurus called out. Infantry in the open. Through the dust, I could see them, about 30 Japanese soldiers charging toward us with rifles and bayonets, screaming their battle cry. They knew they couldn't stop 5 Sherman tanks, but they were going to try anyway. That was the kind of enemy we were fighting, soldiers who would rather die than retreat. Torres traversed the gun and fired a high explosive shell into the middle of the charge. The explosion scattered the Japanese soldiers like leaves, but the survivors kept coming. Henderson's machine gun chattered, cutting down more of them, but a few made it close enough to throw grenades against our hull. The explosions rang against our armor, and I felt the tank shudder. But we kept moving, backing out of that hell with 40 Marines clinging to our hull like their lives depended on it, which they did. "Engine temperature critical," I called out. Steam was starting to leak from the engine compartment, and I could smell the distinctive odor of overheating metal. "How much further can she go?" Kowalski asked. I checked my position. We were about halfway back to our lines, maybe 800 yards of broken ground still to cover. Maybe 5 more minutes before she seizes up completely, I estimated. "Then we better make them count," Kowalski said grimly. The ride back was the longest 5 minutes of my life. Japanese mortar rounds fell around us like deadly rain, and machine gun fire swept our column from positions we'd bypassed on the way in. The Marines on our hull were firing back with whatever weapons they had, but mostly they were just holding on and praying we'd make it. To our left, Boston Brawler took a direct hit from a mortar round. The explosion killed 2 of the Marines riding on the engine deck and wounded several others, but the tank kept moving. That was the thing about Sherman tanks. They could take incredible punishment and keep fighting. Behind us, I could see Japanese soldiers emerging from spider holes and caves, firing at our backs as we retreated. Some of them were setting up machine guns in positions we'd already cleared, ready to cut down the next American attack. This was the nightmare of Peleliu. Every yard of ground you took was contested, and the Japanese could pop up anywhere. "Friendly lines ahead," Henderson called out. I could see the olive-drab figures of Marines in their fighting positions, and the beautiful sight of more Sherman tanks waiting to provide covering fire if we needed it. But we were going to make it. Against all odds, through 800 yards of Japanese killing ground, we were going to make it home with 40 Marines who would have died without us. The engine temperature gauge was pegged in the red zone, and steam was pouring from the radiator grills, but Ironhorse kept running. Detroit iron and American determination, sometimes that's all you need. "Welcome back, Ironhorse," came the voice of Major Blake over the radio. "Beautiful work out there." We crossed into friendly lines just as the engine finally seized up, pistons welding themselves to cylinder walls with a grinding screech of tortured metal. Ironhorse rolled to a stop, her war over for the day, but she'd done her job. 40 Marines climbed down from our hull, some of them kissing the ground, others just standing there in shock at having survived. Captain Morrison found me Aussie climbed out of my driver's hatch. He was a hard-looking man with 3 days of beard and coral dust ground into every line of his face, but his eyes were clear and grateful. "Son," he said, gripping my hand, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my boys' lives today." I looked at the Marines around us, dirty, exhausted, some wounded, but alive. Alive because 5 tank crews had been willing to drive through hell to get them out. That's what we did in the Corps. We didn't leave people behind. "Just doing our job, sir," I said, and meant it. But Captain Morrison shook his head. "No, son. What you did today was something special. Those boys will never forget it, and neither will I." As I watched the survivors of Bravo Company being led away to aid stations and rest areas, I thought about what we'd accomplished. In the larger scope of the Peleliu campaign, it was just one small action, the rescue of 40 Marines from a coral pocket. But to those 40 men, and to their families back home, it was everything. The battle for Peleliu would continue for another month and a half. Before it was over, the 1st Marine Division would suffer over 6,500 casualties, one of the highest casualty rates in Marine Corps history. The Japanese would lose virtually their entire garrison of 15,000 men, fighting to the death in their coral fortresses rather than surrender. But on that day, September 18, 1944, 5 Sherman tanks had driven through hell and brought 40 Marines home. In the arithmetic of war, it was a small victory. In the arithmetic of the human heart, it was everything. I learned later that the Japanese command bunker we destroyed had been Colonel Nakagawa's forward observation post, disrupting his carefully coordinated defense for several hours. It was a small crack in their defensive system, but on Peleliu, every small victory mattered. As for Ironhorse, they towed her back to the rear for engine replacement. She'd fight again, with a new power plant and a fresh coat of olive drab paint. But she'd never forget that run through Death Valley, and neither would I. Years later, people would ask me about Peleliu, about what it was like to fight in that coral hell. I'd tell them about the heat and the dust, about the Japanese bunkers that seemed to sprout from the very rock, about the smell of cordite and death that hung over everything. But mostly, I'd tell them about 40 Marines who got to go home because 5 tank crews refused to leave them behind. In the end, that's what war comes down to, not the grand strategies or the political objectives, but ordinary men doing extraordinary things for each other. That's the story of Peleliu, written in coral dust and blood, paid for with American lives, and measured not in yards of ground taken, but in the number of men who made it home. It was a hard victory, bought at a terrible price, but it was ours. And sometimes, in this world, that has to be enough.